Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Today we have a listener requested show on pest control, specifically for your lofts. We have with us licensed pest control lead technician for Crandall Pest Control, Brandon Beck. Thanks for coming on and talking with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're going to cover a couple things. We're going to talk about, it's that time of the year. It's cold right now. We got mice coming in. We had another request about people who fly and have feral pigeons coming in with their flock of birds, as well as snakes getting in. That was something I dealt with this year. Also skunks, weasels, badgers, and stuff like that. So we're going to cover a couple different things. There might be some overlapping methods of taking care of it, but let's get started with the first one right now. It's cold right now. We got mice coming in. What are some of the problems that you're going to get when you get mice coming in, short of just eating your pigeon feed?
Issues you're going to run into is mice and rats are going to carry lots of diseases. I'm more familiar with the ones that more affect us people, but I'm sure there's plenty of them that could be negative against any of your pigeons. As far as how to go about taking care of them, your best way about it's going to be exclusion work. That's where you're going to sit there and make it so they physically can't get into your lofts. Versus you can also go with a maintenance route where you're going to have bait boxes and whatnot if you have a loft that you just can't fill all the gaps. Or you can do a combination of both. That works really well as well.
But I had one breeding loft that was really getting a lot of activity, and I think that they were just pestering my pigeons so much that they'd jump off of their eggs, just running around in there all the time and just pestering them and getting them out of there. And that loft wasn't really built specifically. It was more of a conversion from a shed into a loft. So it wasn't really built by design to, defend off certain critters like that. I think a lot of the situations could be resolved by just building a loft that would be resistant to that. So for snakes, mice, is there a certain height that, you can get a loft off the ground and to just kind of not even have to worry about that?
Basically, as far as most snakes go, you want to look at about half of the snake's height. So if you've got really big snakes, it's got to be up their ways because most of them, if they can climb, they can do about half their body as far as climbing goes. Mice, they're going to climb up posts, so there's not really a way to do that. It's more just making sure you don't have any gaps. So mice specifically, they can get into anything that's going to be larger than a quarter of an inch. So whenever you're doing anything with exclusion work, I recommend using quarter-inch wire, like quarter-inch wire mesh, or there's foams specifically designed to go against rodents. They don't like the taste of it, and it hardens to a point where it's kind of like them trying to chew concrete. It's not going to go very well for them.
So if there's a loft that's built, it's off the ground, like even 2 or 3 feet, even metal legs and stuff, the mice can get up that.
Yes.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
okay.
so mice are fantastic at climbing. And if you run any electrical to those or do anything like that to keep fans going or have lights on in there, they just climb that up. They're very, very good climbers.
What if you have a loft that is off the ground? Would you wrap the outside of it with a quarter-inch mesh, or would you actually just change the flooring material?
So in that circumstance, if applicable, I would use slick barrier because what that does is you basically paint that on and it makes it so they actually can't grip anything. It's like them trying to climb glass. So I'd paint that on the legs if you could use it. The only problem with that is if it's like untreated wood, it's going to want to absorb that and it's going to get real expensive to slick barrier those legs.
Let's say your loft has like a regular like exterior door. Would an exterior door, just the way it's built, be good enough security for a mice, and just move on to looking at other options with around the building and corners and stuff like that?
Correct. You want to make sure that your door, that exterior door, you want to make sure on the corners there's usually a gap there. So you want to look for any light coming in because if there's light coming in, not only with rodents, but just any kind of pest, you're going to have openings allowing anything to get in there. So that's going to be a major flaw in most buildings is windows, doors, anywhere where you have anything coming into the building from outside. So any kind of piping or electrical, anywhere where there's a hole, make sure it's sealed.
That one breeder loft I had the mice coming into, because I wasn't able to, it's a conversion sort of thing. There's a lot of gaps and stuff. I just started using those bait stations And that seems to work really well as far as knocking numbers. I definitely don't see like mice droppings and stuff like that anymore. It's on the outside. So I mean, because I know some guys will put bait stations on the inside, but you want all the if you're doing the bait station route, that always has to be on the outside, even if you're seeing mice on the inside, right?
If you're doing bait stations inside the building, the one of the problems that you're going to run into with that is you're going to draw them to that bait station. So that's why they work best on the outside, unless you're pairing it with excluding. If you're doing an exclusion, you cover up all your holes, you make sure there's no gaps, nowhere where they're getting in from. A big place that they'll get in from as well is going to be vents. So making sure your vents have some sort of mesh on there so nothing can push through it. If you go that route and then you put a station inside to kind of take care of the problem that exists there currently, that's all right. But primarily, you want to put them on the outside because the whole point of that bait station is it's going to draw the attention of the mice to the bait. Anywhere where you don't want to see mice, I wouldn't recommend putting a bait station there.
No, that makes sense. So stepping up from mice to bigger stuff, because we also had listeners talking about weasels and raccoons and stuff like that getting in. You've heard horror stories about, the amount of damage that one of those can do when they get inside of a loft. They can just decimate it. So, you've talked about exclusion, which seems like that would make sense. What kind of material you're saying using quarter-inch hardwire cloth wire for mice? So,
That's right.
what would be the best way of keeping those bigger ones out?
So the biggest problem that you got with bigger animals like that, they've got a lot more power to them, which means you need a heavier gauge wire. For the most part, we're using something more along that half inch gapping because it's got a stronger wire to it. If you've got both those and rodents, I would typically put the quarter-inch mesh underneath and then put a half inch over that, and then you mount them up. That way, you've got the ability to block out your small stuff and your big stuff. When it comes to the bigger stuff, it's usually they're coming in through the floor. They dig underneath, they get in, So with that, you're going to want to dig down 6 to 8 inches and then at least 18 inches out. You want to bury that, but you also want to make sure that it's secured on the edge that's away from the building. You could do that. Some guys use concrete, others will use like stakes to kind of hold that down.
Securing the flat part that's like extending 18 inches
Yeah,
away. Oh, okay. Okay.
correct. So you're securing that down and then you're covering that back up with the dirt and rock and whatever you've had to trench out. So why that works is because basically they're going to want to dig as close to the building as possible. Whereas if you let them do that, they can get underneath and they start gnawing away at floors and find a way in. Whereas if you have that 18 inches, you'll get some that are a little zealous and they'll go out and go past that to dig down. But when you bury that down there, they dig down and they'll hit that wire and it makes it so they can't go through it.
If you're screening out for mice, how deep do you got to go for that?
About the same thing. It's always best to do that. Same thing with snakes. That way they can't just press up against it and push it out so they go under. It just secures it a lot better.
Talk about that a little bit for the snakes. So whatever the snake's length is, it can go vertically half that length.
Yeah, that's pretty typical is they can go vertically about half that length. So for us, one of our bigger things is going to be stuff like rattlesnakes. We were having a conversation about yours. And I told you it's got to be 36 inches. That's about the average height that a rattlesnake can climb is about 36 inches. You want to make sure you do at least that. And you want to go with quarter-inch mesh so that way their babies can't go through.
I went down, I think about 6 or 8 inches. I didn't really
Yeah.
kick out that much, but I did go down. Are you supposed to kick out a little bit as well?
When you kick it out, it basically just lets it so you don't have to put stakes in. You can just let the weight of the dirt hold it, especially against a snake. Now, if you've got some crazy snakes like over in Australia or Florida, they've got some big snakes and they can push through. I would recommend going at least 12 inches out, bury it, and stake it down.
Especially for like people who have like an aviary setup, because that was, well, I guess my aviary setup is connected to my loft, so I've already had some fencing, but it was pretty large, and who knows where they were getting in, because my door also had some pretty big size gaps in it too. And so I used quarter-inch, and I think I went up about 2 feet. That's about what I'm dealing with the snake size out here. But yeah, there's definitely bigger snakes. So if you're in a spot like that where you got bigger snakes, would you do like how you was talking about with the weasels and stuff? Would you start with a 1/4 inch and then go 1/2 inch on top of that?
You want to go at least a 1/2 inch, with a thicker gauge wire when you're dealing with weasels, badgers, anything that's going to have a bit more power to be able to pull it. Otherwise, they'll just tear through that 1/4 inch.
A lot of flyers keep the loft up off the ground for the sake of letting the droppings fall through, airflow, and somewhat of a rodent control situation. But because we also do ventilation, like when you mentioned too about screening off any vents, like would vents on the roof need to be screened off for mice too?
Yeah, it would. It's more for rats than mice. There's vents that are going to be better than others. If you're getting venting, having vents that have tighter slats, anything smaller than that 1/4 of an inch, you're going to be a lot better off. I still prefer to put a mesh behind it. A lot of them come with a mesh that's really, really thin. That's going to help you with bugs. It's not going to help against rodents. So I still like to put that 1/4 inch behind that and just mount it up. It's going to be your biggest thing is going to be just making sure that they can't go through any kind of venting. If you have gapping between your floors, that's fine. Just make sure they can't get underneath. And that's where excluding around the building helps significantly.
And when you keep saying like excluding, you literally just mean like put up wire fencing, like tight wire
Yeah,
fencing.
you make it
Yeah.
so they literally can't gain access. Yeah, so whenever we're talking exclusion work, it is removing the location they want to go to. We're making it so it's not an option. Yeah, that's the whole purpose of exclusion work.
A really well built, tight structure, no gaps, keep everything as tight as you can. And then when you do got gaps, just fence it off really well, right?
Yeah, fence it off. You can foam it. You can use caulking. So, like indoors, usually I'm using caulking on the edges of doors to kind of block out that light. And then you can form a tighter seal that way as well, because you can make a form fitting, basically a form fitting seal at the edges of your doors. But if you've got anywhere where you've got piping coming in or where you have wiring coming into a building, you want to make sure that you're either using caulk or foam. I prefer foam because I can cover a bigger area a lot faster and have it fill that space, guaranteeing that it's not going to pull away.
And you're talking about just like gap filler, or is there a special rodent kind of foam that they won't chew through?
You can just use pretty much any of the gap fillers, but there is a foam that is a gap filler as well that is specifically designed for rodents.
Well, we've covered everything that crawls on the ground and tries to get in that way. And there's been a couple of people who asked about ferals. They're flying in the city, any area where there's ferals, which is a lot of areas. And they don't want the ferals coming in just for the sake of, well, a couple of reasons. One, probably the most important one is that if you got a sick bird that comes into your loft with your flock, then, now all your birds are sick too. So is there any way that you could think of where you could still have your birds coming in, but kind of filtering out feral birds from all landing and coming into the loft like that?
Feral birds are going to be, they're not going to like basically anything that we're going to use, spikes or anything shiny that makes noise, whirly birds, anything like that. That's a deterrent for them. If you're able to train your birds around those, that would be my best guess as to what would help out with that a lot is if you have young birds that you can teach to just kind of ignore those things that they're naturally not going to like. But if they're used to it, I'd imagine that they could just ignore that and your ferals aren't going to like them. you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess raise them up with it. So what are some of the deterrents you mentioned, like the whirlybird vent things, spikes to keep them from landing down on the roof? Because you still want your birds to hit the roof, and sometimes the only way they can get on the landing board, I guess, would be off of that. But what about like reflective tapes? Does that stuff really work for keeping ferals away, or like fake owls or anything like that?
reflective tapes do, fake owls, unless it moves and moves often, it's not going to do anything. They'll land right on top of it. And the second any of yours land on it, it's no longer a threat.
There you go. Then yeah, because if they are around it, then they probably know it's not a threat and probably would land on top of it.
Exactly. So anything like that is going to be a huge waste of money. I've seen some that are kind of neat that use a motion sensor and you hook it up to a hose and it starts spraying water. But again, your birds won't get used to that.
Oh yeah.
That's not one that you could really use. And that would work against all kinds of different birds as well, not just feral pigeons, but even some of your the BOPs aren't going to like that one. As far as ones that I would use, the purpose of the spikes is you take away the leading edges because they want to land on a leading edge so that they can take off really quickly in case of predator. And so if you take that out, it makes it so they can't comfortably sit there. Right. So it's kind of the same thing with exclusion work. You want to take away the spots they want to go to. Now, like you said, you want to make sure your birds still land there, so that's not your best options, but I would say using whirlybirds, which are these shiny cups that kind of spin. And so it's reflective, it moves, and a lot of times it's got a little bit of a sound to it, so they don't like that.
I've seen people do this too to keep them out. Would be they'll hang like CDs, and they'll kind of blow around them. They'll make like a little wind chime kind of thing. They'll move around and they'll throw a little bit of light. I mean, do you think that's going to be effective at all?
Absolutely, especially if you have them where they kind of clack together. That does essentially the same job as the whirlybirds. It's going to spin around. They're a lot cheaper to do it that way using old CDs, but it spins around. I would use fishing line in between them, but you want to make sure that if you're doing that, you're hanging them off of a tree or somewhere where they have access to spin. And when it's windy, that they kind of knock into each other and make some noise.
Okay, yeah. So you've mentioned noise then too. So a little bit of noise is another good deterrent to keep them separated out.
Correct.
Yeah, I think all those. I mean, that makes sense if you can just get if you can get your birds. I mean, even your established birds, just get them used to it, and then any birds that start coming generations down the road, even if they kind of don't like it, it'll be that filter for, let's say they go out and fly and they go, especially homers or something, they go do some serious routing and pick up a few strays here and there. They all come back and they don't think nothing of it, whereas that other one might not like it and might not want to come in because it's a hard thing, unless you have some sort of ID band on all of your birds that are coming in and one sets off an alarm that's not part of it. That does seem about the most practical way of doing it.
Absolutely. That would make the most sense.
Better do the CD thing right away before those things become vintage and worth a lot of money and hard to buy.
Exactly.
Oh no, this has all been really good. Yeah, it's just and especially on the Facebook, I've been seeing a lot of different people this time of the year, really, how do I get rid of mice, and then the people who are like, especially rooftop flying more on the East Coast, like they like trapping birds, but not everybody does. Sometimes people will go in their loft and, it might be cool. Hey, I got someone's bird because it has a band on it, but if you're bringing in birds that aren't part of your thing and you do have a lot of birds, then, you could be really risking an outbreak and stuff. So yeah, these are all really good tips.
Biosecurity is going to be one of your biggest things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Cause we all should be doing some sort of biosecurity, even when people are coming in. I know some guys have talked about having a little bit of bleach water outside so you can, bleach out your shoes and not bring anything in it, especially if you just came from your loft or something.
Absolutely.
All righty. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing all this with us. I hope everybody is going to, give some of these efforts to keeping your lofts a little bit more secure and leaving all the nasty stuff out and good stuff in. But thanks for coming on and sharing all your knowledge and experience with us. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast, and make sure to leave a good review or at least a 5-star for the podcast wherever you listen. If you have a topic or a person you want to hear more about on the podcast, or if you yourself would like to be a guest, just send an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.